morning. Today's book is called The Fantastic Flying Books of Mr. Morris Lessmore by William Joyce. Morris Lessmore loved words. He loved stories. He loved books. His life was a book of his own writing, one orderly page after another. He would open it every morning and write of his joys and sorrows, of all that he knew and everything that he hoped for. But every story has its upset. One day the sky darkened, the wind blew and blew. Till everything Morris knew was scattered, even the words in his book. He didn't know what to do or which way to go, so he began to wonder. Notice all of the houses and the fences that are knocked down. Everything looks gray. Then a happy bit of happenstance came his way. Rather than looking down, as had become his habit, Morris Lessmore looked up. Drifting through the sky above him, Morris saw a lovely lady. She was being pulled along by a festive squadron of flying books. Morris wondered if his book could fly, but it couldn't. It would only fall to the ground with a depressing thud. The flying lady knew that Morris simply needed a good story, so she sent him her favorite. The book was an amiable fellow and urged Morris to follow him. The book led him to an extraordinary building where many books apparently nested. Morris slowly walked inside and discovered the most mysterious and inviting room he had ever seen. It was filled with the fluttering of countless pages, and Morris could hear the faint chatter of 1,000 different stories, as if each book was whispering an invitation to adventure. Then his new friend flew up to him and landed on his arm. It held itself open, as if hoping to be read. The room rustled to life. And so Morris's life among the books began. Morris tried to keep the books in some sort of order, but they always mixed themselves up. The tragedies needed cheering up and would visit the comedies. The encyclopedias, weary of facts, would relax with the comic books and fictions. All in all, it was an agreeable jumble. Morris found great satisfaction in caring for the books, gently fixing those with fragile bindings and unfolding the dog-eared pages of others. Sometimes Morris would become lost in a book and scarcely emerge for days. I have to tell you that this is one of my favorite illustrations, actually falling into the book. Hanging out in the binding over here. Morris liked to share the books with others. Sometimes it was a favorite that everyone loved. And other times he found a lonely little volume whose tale was seldom told. Everyone's story matters, said Morris, and all the books agreed. I want you to notice something about this illustration. See, Morris, who is enlivened by stories, is in color. And so is this little boy who has read the stories and is moving on. But look at the people who are in need of some stories and what they look like. At night, after all the stories that needed telling had been told, and everyone settled down in their proper places on the shelves, the great big dictionary would get in the last word. And then, it was then, that Morris Lessmore would once again write in his own book. He wrote of his joys and sorrows, of all that he knew, and everything that he hoped for. The days passed, and so did the months. And then years and years. And Morris Lessmore became stooped and crinkly. But the books never changed. Their stories stayed the same. Now his old friends took care of him the way he had once cared for them, and they read themselves to him each night. Then one day, he filled the last page of his book. He looked up and said with a bittersweet sigh, I guess it's time for me to move on. The books were sorry, but they understood. Morris put on his hat and took his cane. As he went to the door, he turned and smiled, then waved goodbye. I'll carry you all in here, he said, and pointed to his heart. The books waved their pages, and Morris Lessmore flew away. And as he flew, he changed back to the way he'd been that long ago day when they all first met. The books were quiet for a while. Then they noticed that Morris Lessmore had left something behind. It's his book, said his oldest friend. Inside was Morris's story, all of his joys and sorrows, all that he knew, and everything he had hoped for. Then the books heard a small, expectant sound, and there in the doorway was a little girl. She looked around with wonder, then something fantastic happened. Morris Lessmore's book flew up to her and opened its pages. The girl began to read, and so our story ends as it begins, with the opening of a book. is one of those stories that I like more every time I read it. Because as Christians, what we do is we tell the best story in the world. We tell the story about who Jesus is and who God is and how we know who God is because of how we know Jesus. And those are our family stories, and they've been told not just from our lifetimes, but for thousands and thousands of years. They've been told across oceans, across deserts, in places high on mountains, in places far, far away, and in our own homes, and our own churches, and our own Sunday schools. And the great thing about the stories that we tell as Christians, the stories in our books of all of our joys and sorrows, and all that we know, and all that we hope for, is it's a story that endures and invites us to write our own story within its pages. So I hope that you enjoyed this book. Like I said, it's one of my favorites, probably one of my family's favorites. But it's also a book that reminds us of why our stories, our biblical stories, our personal stories, our family stories matter. And everyone's story is important. Thanks be to God.